Today's episode, and I love these episodes as we go deeper, much deeper into topics that students, our fellow colleagues are really looking for to understand the actual operationalizing muscle biology. And this is a big pop culture topic too, because a lot of everyone's resistance training is exploding. People are working out. We love it. It's great. But it's also important to understand what is actually happening inside your muscles. So we have Dr. Brandon Roberts here with us today to discuss the inner workings of muscle biology. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Darren. Happy to be on. Follow every podcast, listen to a lot of them. So it's exciting to come on and talk muscle biology.
Well, and I think that you are certainly the person to talk about this. You're writing about it, you're doing textbooks about it. So we are going to get a real treat about this. And I have some awesome questions I think that our viewers will really love to get some insight from you on. So without further ado, let's take a deeper dive into muscle biology, and let's start from the beginning as much as you would like to on this here.
Yeah. So when I think beginning, I think like cell level, and that's kind of how I was in my head portraying this and how it was going. So if we think about a cell, like cell biology 101, you have a nucleus, you have some mitochondria, you have some ribosomes, you have a lot of different things in there, right? And the nice thing or the special thing about muscle is it's multinucleated. It's one of the very few cells. And the reason for that is because muscle fibers or muscle cells, same thing, are monstrous. They are so big, right? And so you have this little nucleus in there throughout the whole muscle cell. There's a bunch of them, and they have to send messages on what's happening in your body or what's not happening to function properly and adapt if needed, right? So that's the first thing I wanted to kind of point out to your listeners, and you already know this, but the fact that muscle cells are multinucleated is something that really drew them to me, or drew me to them. And in fact, we call muscle plastic because it can adapt so well. So I want to start there and kind of lay the groundwork, and we'll work outwards from there.
Perfect. Sounds good.
Yeah. So we're in the muscle cell, and we have nuclei. We have mitochondria, which are the powerhouse to the cell, right? Again, biology 101. We have ribosomes, which are the things that make muscle protein synthesis. So in muscle, the other kind of unique thing is because it's so big, it has a ton of proteins in it. So think myosin and actin, different like dystrophin, different proteins in it. And so what we do is as we need them, these ribosomes create proteins. And so there are a lot of drugs that kind of can inhibit this, or exercise can increase it, or diseases can stop it too. So now pause there, right? And so now in this muscle fiber, we're still in the fiber, we need to move. So we have these proteins called myosin and actin. They sit over top of each other, not exactly, but kind of, right? One of the popular theories, or really, it's not a theory anymore, I would say, but kind of mechanisms of movement is the sliding filament theory. And so these two proteins, myosin and actin, slide back and forth over each other. But they don't really slide, they more like ratchet. So in your mind, picture someone like climbing a glacier, and they have these picks and they're like ratcheting up, right? They're going up the mountain. And so we have this cross bridge cycling, is what we call it, where the myosin and actin overlap and ratchet so that you get your muscle to contract. Um, so the idea there is when you contract, you can move things. So we have a couple different types of contraction. We'll save that for later, maybe. Uh, but the energy that you use to contract your muscle is ATP, right? So that's why ATP is important. May have seen in like cartoons, or maybe in science somewhere, something called tetanus or rigor mortis, where you like go super stiff, right? And that's because your muscles can't move. So that's kind of a good example I use for people. So I'll pause there for a second and then see if you have anything for me yet.
Yeah, so I'm guessing you're probably going to get to this because you're going in exactly how I would imagine it here for that. in getting to discussing, and maybe I'm jumping ahead a little bit about talking about the sarcoplasmic reticulum, calcium, acetylcholine, and the process of muscular contraction starting with the, going through neuromuscular junction, all of that. I think it would be important for, because, we don't think about that when we talk about, we just think about muscular contraction. And for a lot of students, they do see the sliding filament theory, Krebs cycle, the whole thing. But I think it's always so interesting to discuss the kind of the chemical processes that are happening for this to actually happen.
Yeah, so that is where I was slowly getting to. But I actually was reading today about Botox, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's one that many listeners have used or know about. And we'll use that in a couple seconds. But so when you think neuromuscular junction, right, you have to tell your muscles to move. The muscles that we're going to talk about today was the skeletal muscle, right? You don't have to tell your heart to contract. You don't have to, which is cardiac muscle. You don't have to tell your gut to use a smooth muscle to move things through it. That's automatic. So in skeletal muscle, we have to tell it to contract. And so how we do that is we send a signal from our brain, right? And then you have kind of a motor neuron, which is a neuron that sends a signal across to muscle fibers. So remember, a muscle fiber is one cell. And across this, we have this process where you have sodium and calcium and potassium, which flux and create this kind of polarization, kind of like a shock, but not really like a shock, that cause acetylcholine to go from the motor neuron to the muscle. And that effect is where something like Botox comes in. So you're telling your muscle contraction, you send the acetylcholine across, it binds the muscle, and then it opens calcium in the sarcoplasmic reticulum and the T tubules. Right? So when you think about muscle, you're like, all right, it's a bunch of bundles. Each muscle fiber is stacked into more fibers and more bundles, and it's really like a thick cord with stuff wrapped around it. Um, so within the muscle, the way that the signal from your motor neuron gets down into your muscle is it needs a way to like go through the middle. And so that's where the T tubules come in, where these signals propagate, and then you can contract muscles. Now, the way Botox works is it stops acetylcholine from releasing. So when you go and you say you get your like face done or whatever, and you can't contract that muscle, it then slowly over time, right, reduces wrinkles because you can't do that movement. If you get an injection, and people do for certain diseases, like in your biceps, like you wouldn't be able to do it there either, but the dose would be a little bigger. So that's a good example of something that some people use and we use to treat people. To send that neuromuscular junction, that gap, that signal to the muscle from there. Did I leave anything out?
No, that was great. The Botox example is really interesting. Actually hadn't heard of that particular example before. I think it will resonate with people for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I got a post going up on LinkedIn, like, tomorrow about that,
Awesome.
so that's why I was, like, deep in that, the Botox world for a little bit. Mm. Okay, so now the other nice thing about muscle, or the interesting thing, is that when you contract muscle, not all of it contracts at once. Like, think about all the muscles in your arms. If your brain told you to move and you contract everything, you would, like, break a bone. Right? So we have this kind of cycling of muscle fibers, and within each muscle fiber, you have a signal that's propagated, and a single muscle fiber is all or none. So it either contracts fully or it doesn't contract at all. And then, like, say you're doing something, moving or whatever, you'll cycle muscle fibers, right, to kind of create that movement. Now, if you do something maximal, let's say you're like, I'm going to push against this wall and I know it can't move, but I'm going to use 100% of my force. You'll activate everything, right, as much as you can. There'll be a little bit of reserve. But then, that's the main way, think of a max deadlift or something, that you activate all the muscle fibers. So I think from there, where should we go?
Well, it's
Hmm.
interesting. Let me ask you a question on this because
Yeah.
I think this is an interesting thing. And the concept maybe of kind of a central governing system. Um, that if you were to release your true maximum potential, muscular wise, that there would be pretty large consequences. So, are we talking that in the sense that the body has essentially a built in mechanism that keeps a person from having to essentially injure themselves from this process?
Yeah, yeah. And so you have in your muscle like fibers and within them and between them, you have these things that tell you, you know, how they're contracting, tension. So you have muscle spindles. If you think about pressure within a muscle, there's Golgi tendons, right? And then those are kind of interesting because if you watch sports, right, you'll see someone like go down and like grab their leg really quickly, but they're not injured. And usually that's like a spindle telling them, oh, you over contracted or overextended that muscle. So we're gonna send pain signals. So you don't want that. But you're actually okay because we can move quite a bit and be okay. That's another good example of like I play soccer, and so that happens to me occasionally as I'm aging. I'm like, oh, yeah, and then I'm like, okay, okay, we're good. Just muscle spindles, little tendon action. We're okay.
Awesome. That makes so much sense. I love the real life examples, is I think that is so common, I'm gonna say, or what you
Yeah.
see, and I think what's interesting, I'm a big football fan, and I think always there's so many injuries in the NFL this year. And I know that I think the NFL has spent quite a bit of money trying to solve soft tissue injuries for that. Obviously, for the product, they're paying the players a lot of money, you want to keep them on the field. But yeah, I noticed so many hamstring injuries. And maybe I'm jumping way ahead on here this, but I always think and this may be good for the audience, why and especially for students, why there's such a large preponderance of hamstring related soft tissue injuries versus quadricep based soft tissue injuries.
Yeah, yeah. So we will definitely I like that, because there are a ton of hamstring injuries and they take forever to repair.
Yes.
Um, but I think as I'm a natural competitive bodybuilder, one of the things I've found, is that most people will train their quads way more, and that tends to, figure into the injury component. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that too, then we can go back down into the
Yeah.
talking about muscle
We
fibers.
will definitely go back down. I don't know why I just thought about it. Sometimes this happens,
Okay.
I just yeah, I think it's very quad dominant training society. And I think for also like hamstring training, I think there's kind of this notion too that maybe lack of variety in training the hamstring, sometimes a little bit more difficult to train that muscular group, semi-tendinosis, membranosis, the whole thing there. It just seems like it's much easier to be, oh, quads, no problem. There's a lot
Yeah.
of things available, modalities available for that. And maybe that's just a guess, for that. But so I was just really curious about that. Again, we can jump back into that, but that's just my 2 cents related to it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that makes sense, and it's true, it's completely true, especially, um, you know, athletes that do certain sports like football and soccer. It's hard to train those muscles, so,
Yeah.
so let's go back down. So we're in the muscle, right? We talked about the contraction, we talked about myosin actin and nuclei and stuff. The next thing that I often get asked on, and when I teach this course, is muscle fiber types. People always want to know tell me about muscle fiber types. Can I change my muscle fiber type? Is it like genetic? Tell me more, right? And so I have this unique perspective because we actually do muscle biopsies. So we take pieces of muscle and it'll think like an eraser size head, out of a quad, essentially, is what it is. And I also work with animals, and you can take the whole muscle there. But in humans, there are three main fiber types, we'll call them. There's like a bunch of hybrids, and if you are really like a big muscle head, you'll be like, no, there's like seven. But we're gonna focus on three because right, students. So we have our type one, which is our slow twitch fibers, right? Those have kind of a lot of oxidative capacity. They have a lot of endurance. They're recruited first. We have our type 2A fibers, which are like our between fibers. They have some oxidative capacity. They have some glycolytic capacity, which is metabolism. And then, so I'll come back to 2A, but 2X is on the opposite end of type 1. So those are fast twitch. they're very fragile. They're usually big, um, and they usually act very quickly. And kind of when we think of maximal force, that's what we're getting to the recruitment of with type 2X. So, you know, generally speaking, we can change these with training, but we kind of all start out, depending on the muscle, roughly the same, right? So maybe you have a athlete who's like of a lineage of track stars or like running stars. There's a good likelihood that they will have a maybe a better fiber type distribution or some other genetic enhancement. In terms of like how we change this with like drugs, I haven't like there's a way to do it. When you lose muscle, everything goes from type 2A to type 2X because type 2X is fragile. So those are the biggest, but they get broken down first. When you run a lot, there's not a big shift towards type 1 fibers, but it's can be about 5% more than normal, maybe 10%. Um, I have pulled biopsies out of runners that is like, call it a plug. That's like all type 1 fibers. And you're like, they're pure type 1. Okay. Right. It's kind of interesting. Uh, and so the other difference is blood distribution. So your capillaries, right, which your blood brings oxygen to your muscles. That's really important. And the type 1 fibers, you usually have a few more capillaries than the type 2 um, muscle fibers. Yeah. So I'll pause there.
Man, this is an interesting area. Again, great one-on-one information, especially for students and honestly for trainers who haven't had formal education. They need to have this. But one interesting, I was a collegiate track and field athlete, so I resonate with this big time. And one of the things that I always thought was interesting, this was just observationally back in the day, but also I see is there have been plenty of sprinters who have gone on to become pretty decent recreational distance runners over time, but you rarely ever see a hardcore distance runner become a great sprinter at some point. Can you talk a little bit about that kind of correlation there?
Yeah, yeah. And so like I'm genetically, if you can get a test that tells you like what you lean towards.
Yeah.
And so I'm more of it's a protein called actinin 3. Um, and so I'm more of like an endurance type athlete. Um, but I'm playing soccer, but also I'm a bodybuilder, which is like, the opposite end. I just don't sprint apparently. So I, if you there's a couple of studies that have compared endurance and track athletes, like maybe not Olympic level, but probably like world qualifiers or like national level. And they do see the difference where you'll have kind of more type 1 fibers with your endurance runners, and they'll also have all these other adaptations, right? They'll have more capillaries, more mitochondria, um, even some of their kind of connective style proteins are a little bit different. Whereas on the other end, you have your sprinters, they'll have more type 2A. And with training, this is something most people don't realize, is pretty much any style training with little resistance will take your type 2X fibers and convert them to type 2A fibers. So when we do training studies and we do biopsies, I'll pull a biopsy out of like, say, an older adult or something. They'll have maybe 10% max type 2X fibers. By the time their training is done, 12 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever, they'll have like 1 or 2%. And the reason that happens is because those type 2X fibers are so fragile, right? The body's like, no, we don't want to break those fibers every time we work out. We want to shift that to something more stable, more metabolically efficient, right? So you have, just more metabolism can be used, types of metabolism for those type 2A fibers. So that's something that most people don't realize is that, you inadvertently get rid of most of your type 2X fibers. There are people that I've seen like super elite power lifters, probably some sprinters who do have still a proportion of that type 2X fiber. And that might be why, they're so strong, they're so fast. But we don't know for sure.
Oh, I love that. Very interesting stuff there. Yeah. Muscle fiber types, just such a I wanna say it's like a lightning rod topic a little bit, especially, especially in athletics, when you're talking about competitive athletics and gaining an edge and training adaptation, for the how could we look at this for your, let's say, general recreational exerciser or fitness pros working with clients or in general population and how this would be applicable for them?
Yeah, so I honestly so I've seen a lot of, we'll call, like, protocols to figure out, are you fast twitch or slow twitch? And honestly, for most people, it doesn't really matter. Like, you can't necessarily, other than your training style, target only your type 1 or only your type 2, because as you increase your force, you're going to recruit all the fibers, right? So, you know, other than, say, you want to develop your type 1 fibers or focus on those, you would just run more, do more endurance
Yeah.
activity. Um, but you also need, for injury prevention, to do some like resistance training and stuff. But so I tell people not to worry about it. If you see something on the internet, it's like, do this protocol of 185-pound bench reps. And if you get 12, you're fast twitch. And if you get 7, you're slow twitch. It's like, no, that's not true. Sorry.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm like, that's a neat idea, but
That's a neat idea, sure.
yeah. So yeah, I tell most people not to worry about it. Just train to whatever you want to do and your body will adapt. And if you're not adapting, then maybe you need to change something or not
Right.
try harder, but change something.
Okay. Awesome. So we're on
Yeah.
muscle fiber types. Where are we going from here as we kind of make this journey through muscle biology?
Yeah. So okay. So we're up a level at the whole muscle level. We could start. Let's start to talk about. I mentioned myonuclei and how there's this myonuclear domain, right? So each nucleus can support a certain area, and that's a theory still, but I think it's pretty true.
Okay.
Um, so now, fibers on the outside of your fibers, you have another type of cell called a satellite cell. So it's in the muscle, it just sits on the outside of your muscle fiber. And what that does is when you need to grow or you need to repair a tear or something, these satellite cells migrate into the muscle so they become another nucleus, right? So they're activated some way. Um, and then they kind of just do what a normal nuclei in a muscle does is they send messages, they repair, they adapt. Um, you can actually see this and cause this in humans and animal models where you can like do a really hard training session, like a eccentric overload a bunch, and you'll see satellite cells come in and repair that muscle and it'll go pretty much back to normal. Um, there are ways to kill satellite cells, so not humans, but you can basically, if you kill them, you can't adapt as much to like training, so you wouldn't be able to grow as big of a muscle, or obviously repair a muscle if it didn't exist. So I think that's one of the other neat little things about muscle. Is it has this satellite cell that sits on the outside, and when you take a muscle biopsy, you can actually stain for it. You can see it sitting there, and then when you see it move to the middle, you know it's active and it produces some other proteins. You can stain for it there too, so it like lights up. Um, so I think that's something most people don't get till like the advanced level type of muscle biology stuff. Um, the other aspects, I think, I have a list over here. I'm kind of sneaking at. Um, yeah, is we could move into adaptation, I suppose.
Yeah.
Because I'm thinking structurally, you've got all these factors. There are certain diseases, right, that maybe will help people understand things. So muscular dystrophy is not a very common disease, but it's
Right.
got good notoriety. Like people know what it is, and you're like, okay, like what actually is it, right? So within the muscle cell, you have that myosin actin, but connected to the top of the muscle cell, right? You have something to hold that in place because you don't, these are structural. They're very organized. They're very controlled. They're just not like floating around in your muscle cells. So dystrophin is one of those extracellular matrix proteins that holds the muscle kind of where it's supposed to be. And if it's gone, right, it one deforms, two, it can't really adapt or grow. And so you end up with kind of muscle. weakness, muscle loss over time. And they really don't have like for muscular dystrophy, they don't have any cures yet. They're
Yeah.
working on a couple rescue things, but I think that's one where you've seen it on TV, probably a commercial for it. But a good example of how a disease at the structural level can really mess up your muscles.
You know what's good? I think kind of joining this because we're kind of in that state, and I mean, important to talk about, but certainly less severe. The muscular dystrophy is just the concept of sarcopenia and
Okay.
discussing that as we age and decline, obviously, and muscle quality, things of that nature. This, I think, will resonate very big with the audience. It's because we're all getting older, we're all aging, and
Yeah.
in what I do, and a lot of people, you're working with a lot of people who are getting older. A lot of my clientele now are in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and like a baseline discussion of sarcopenia, and I think that would be a great segue into training adaptation with it as well.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's great. So I did after a PhD, I did my PhD in muscle loss with like cancer and diabetes and all these other things. But in my postdoc, which is like a residence for a doctor, I focused on aging and resistance training. So in aging, you have this thing I mentioned called sarcopenia, which is the loss of muscle mass over time. And it's arguable exactly where it starts. Like if you never exercise, where it starts. But most people would tell you 50 to 55, somewhere in there, where you slowly start losing muscle. It's about 1% a year. And you can exercise and kind of like attenuate or reduce that loss. But it's about 1% a year. And with that, you lose muscle size, but you also lose mobility and muscle strength, which is what most people notice, right? I had a client once who was like, I just really want to be able to pick up a gallon of milk and pour it in my cup. And I'm like, okay, we can do that. Like, let's work on arm strength and grip strength and some other strength. And I'm like, we'll get there. And after 3 or 4 months, he was like, I got it yesterday. I was like, sweet.
Awesome.
Um, yeah. So I think when we get into sarcopenia, it is a functional decline. It's nothing you can like prevent completely, even if you exercise a ton. There are some drugs that can kind of prevent it, but not prevent it, maybe stop it from occurring as quickly, but they're not that great. Um, and so we're resulting with how do you stop sarcopenia as you exercise? There's also something called anabolic resistance in aging adults. And what that means is that when you eat protein, so like you think take a protein shake after your workout, it doesn't cause as much muscle growth or muscle protein synthesis as like you 20 years ago. So now you've got this sarcopenia effect. You've got this kind of reduction in response to food, and so you're like, okay, I'm not doing too well. But if you exercise, that's where it comes a long way, and you can start getting out of those holes. We also in our society have like an obesity problem, right? So you'll see people who may maintain the same exact weight or close to it, lose muscle, but be gaining fat, which is not ideal at all. And so there's something called sarcopenic obesity, where you can be obese and actually not have that much muscle at all. And it's kind of like a double-edged sword. So yeah, I'll pause there and see if you have
Yeah.
anything to add on sarcopenia.
Yeah, I think one, I think the importance of it is just gigantic. And we're kind of in a resistance training golden age in many ways, where so many people are piling onto it, which is wonderful to see. But I'm curious, like in your studies and the work you've done, we talk about mitigating as much as we can sarcopenia. From what we currently know, what's the percentage of mitigation we're talking about here that resistance training does to help to mitigate this?
Yeah, so I would say I'm gonna have to ballpark this because there's no really long study, right? Most
Mm,
studies are like 12 to maybe half a year, 12 weeks to 26 weeks if you're lucky. But I would say if you start resistance training at 50 and you're gonna lose, 50% of your muscle over the next 50 years, you can probably reduce that by 80%, which is quite a bit,
wow.
right? And until you get to like age 80. And that's when things start to get much more difficult, where you can't do enough to fight off the other declines that are happening. But like from 50 to 75, or 80, like you can like keep most of your muscles. I mean, granted, you'll still lose some, and your
Yeah.
strength will probably decline a little more. But like once people retire, you'll often see that's when they start considering their health and they're like, oh, hey, I've got time to go exercise now. Hopefully they've done it and they're not like afraid of it, which is another problem. But I'll see people actually kind of like gain muscle in their 60s because they haven't been able to do anything. I'm like, oh, yeah. I mean, yeah, you're stronger and you have more muscle and you feel like you look better because like you have more time to train. So it's
Yeah.
very powerful, like you said.
Yeah, it's really powerful. Can you talk just a little further about the mechanisms behind getting to kind of that sticking point? You talked about the 80s. What is it in that decade that the tide turns, and even with regular resistance training, it's an uphill battle. It's difficult.
Yeah, yeah. I think because of everything else in your body, right? So your body is 40% muscle roughly. But you've got tendons that are declining, you've got bones that are declining. You have all these other most people don't get to that far without having some kind of health issues for the most part. So these things start to stack and affect different organs other than muscle in your body. And we really don't know. Like we know if you took an 80-year-old and you put them on an exercise regimen, they would improve, they would get better. Like life changing, but we don't have enough data for like 80 to 100-year-olds where we can see like why is this happening. Like I would assume from what I've seen, it's just all of the things that have been going down or just they just keep going down. And now you're at the end of the chain and you're just kind of hanging on by a thread. So I don't have a great answer for you, but you can still actually improve quality of life in your 80s if you start training them.
I actually think that's a great answer because I think I'm not sure that we've necessarily had the population of people to study this. When looking at life expectancy, man, most especially males are certainly dying before females, life expectancy wise, and I mean we are seeing a lot more centenarians now. I think there's a projection of like 20 years or something like that would be close to 1 million centenarians, and not that long ago it was pretty rare for that. So maybe we just haven't had enough people in the population to study. Potentially.
Yeah.
I don't know, it's just I'm thinking, like, where are we getting all these folks to actually do this, at that age?
Yeah, yeah, most of the studies are like, you'll get 10 people in their 80s to do the
Yeah.
study for each group, and you're like, "Okay, that's not quite enough." One of the things that when I was in Birmingham that was really cool was we studied masters athletes, and so it was like the masters like Olympics, basically,
Yes.
and so they had track and field and all this stuff, and so we didn't take any muscle biopsies because they were like, "No, we need our muscle," and I was like, "Cool, that's fine." Uh, um and they're athletes, right? So they're like
Yeah.
breaking world, like, or at least national records in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. And you see this kind of resurgence now with, like you said, people have been exercising more, and some people have taken it maybe more seriously than others. Like there's a longevity kick now. You have a whole generation that's coming up like, hey, I want to take care of my body and I know how and I have the time and energy and space. Or maybe 30, 40 years ago, people didn't have that as much. So yeah, I'm really excited to see like when I'm 60 to 80, like what that looks like.
Yeah, me too, because I just think people are different now, like, you people I mean, I'm gonna be 50 in a couple years, and I don't look like what someone who's 50 used to look like. It was just a lot of hard living, not a lot of exercise, just grinding all the time. So I think humans, because of this, are just starting to look very different. I think even just observationally, you see it. Someone who's been pretty dedicated to it, you see them, you're like, wow, that's a possibility for me.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I'm noticing as I'm aging too is if you can avoid, stress, which is kind of hard to do nowadays.
Mhm.
But if you can avoid stress and you can keep your like adiposity or fat levels to a reasonable amount, it seems like those type of people just age better.
Yeah.
They have like their skin looks better. They're usually working out more. they're sleeping better. So it's all kind of interconnected. But
Yeah.
I think people ask me like, what's the one thing I can do to really help me besides exercise? And I'm like, all right, you've got to control your nutrition, right? Because if you're exercising, great improvements. But if you're gaining 5 pounds a year, or you like yo-yo diet and you have this obesity aspect, like it causes inflammation, which is another thing that happens as you age. A lot of people have just kind of chronic inflammation, and I'm not
Yeah.
talking anything like monstrous, just, hey, I used to be at 1 in my blood, we'll call it an arbitrary level, and now I'm at like 3, right? So that's not a big difference, whereas like 6 or 7 would be an infection, but it's enough to chronically degrade your systems in your body, to some extent.
Yeah, it makes sense. Let's jump into training adaptations as we move along here. Just this is the bread and butter for a lot of people, right? They're like, oh, what happens when I work out, when I resistance train? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, all right. So we'll start with. So I said a little bit about it, but we'll start with resistance training because I think that's our favorite, both of ours.
Hmm.
So when you resistance train, right, you send signals in your body that increase protein synthesis, and that's how muscles grow. And after a workout, let's say you're never worked out, your muscle protein synthesis will go up for about 3 days because it's got a lot of things to replace and break down, and kind of you have the normal processing, and then it's like, oh, I've got to adapt now. Cool. So now that's an untrained person is what they call it. So now if you look at our muscle protein synthesis, or most of your clients probably, it elevates for roughly 24 to 36 hours. So you see this increase. You see that's your time when people try to add supplements to increase it even further, and you can with protein, you can get a nice little bump. Um, and so that's a signal and what your body does after resistance training to force that adaptation of strength and size. I think most people don't realize that in training, there are like size and strength go together to an extent. But if you ever look at a power lifter, you'll notice that like they're probably not really jacked. Or if you ever looked at a bodybuilder, you're like, oh, they're strong, but they're not like as strong as a power lifter. And that's because we see a difference in trainings where you can focus on muscle strength, and it's a lot of that neuromuscular adaptation you talked about before. Whereas um, generally speaking, you can also target kind of muscle hypertrophy and not worry as much about the neuromuscular component, so you wouldn't be as strong. There's there's a paper I wrote back in the day on different types of hypertrophy, and it might be a little too deep, but we thought for a little while that you could maybe increase the muscle like uh, sarcoplasmic area in your muscle, and it was called sarcoplasmic hypertrophy. Um, we haven't really seen that pan out in the literature. Um, so what you're seeing is everything grows inside your muscle. Um, those proteins get bigger. The sarcoplasm gets bigger in retrospect, and even like some of the like fascia, right, has to adapt too because now you've got a bigger muscle. Right? So
Yeah.
pretty much everything is moving and adapting.
Yeah. I think, this is a ripe with like, how do I get an edge? How do I get bigger? How do I get strong? Right. This is a lot of the audience too, is all these different aspects of this. And I think a good tie into this with adaptation and discussing this and what happens after is muscular soreness. And so let's break down a little bit what muscular soreness is, and is this something that is actually beneficial or counterproductive in this experience?
Yeah, so this is another big like I call it like myth in resistance training lore. So muscle soreness is formally called like delayed onset muscle soreness, and that's delayed because it peaks really at 48 hours. You'll get some muscle soreness sometimes even right after a workout if you do a really hard session. But if you look at most data, it peaks 48 hours. It comes back or down around 72 hours or 3 or 4 days. Right? You don't actually want to be sore because it's uncomfortable one, but from an adaptation perspective, it doesn't hurt you to be sore. I tell people you know, what happens is you break down all those um, structural proteins, and you've got to rebuild them. And they do kind of rebuild stronger. But the reason I tell people not to aim for soreness is because when you look at muscle soreness and muscle growth, they're not very well correlated. And it's because it's uncomfortable. There's also some aspects of mobility in terms of like, say I do a leg session and I'm still sore for my next leg session. Well, now I'm not squatting as deep. Maybe I'm not doing as much intensity. So you have those aspects. So I tell people in general, don't aim for soreness. What generally happens when people get sore is they're doing something they either haven't done in a long time or in a new way, right? Um, so I think that's the crux of it. The, there's a lot of literature on like, NSAIDs. I studied NSAIDs for a few years and
Mhm.
supplements to reduce soreness. And it's like if it's extreme, yes, but it's a natural process and that's okay. Like suck it up basically.
I think there's so much that people equate soreness with growth. I think it's just kind of a
Yeah.
natural thing people think about. So it's good to break it down and just think about it in that sense. And I want to dive deeper into this too, because another thing people associate muscle soreness in the process of the actual process of resistance training is the quote unquote burning sensation or the discussion around lactic acid. This is also a very popular discussion. And for at least when I was in college in the 90s and we're learning about lactic acid and lactate and all this, it became this huge pop culture thing. It's like, oh, you feel the burn of lactic acid, you're getting that lactic acid, and people throw the term lactic acid around. So let's talk like more operationalize this and discuss maybe some myths and the realities around lactic acid and resistance training.
Yeah, yeah. So that's another, you're hitting all the good ones. There's like a dozen or so. So lactate is a metabolic substrate, right? So you have ATP that I talked about earlier,
Mhm.
and you have your glycogen, which is in your muscles, another form of getting energy out and creating that ATP. So when you exercise, you can create lactate, and it goes through a different cycle to produce ATP. Now, the burn that you feel is really kind of hydrogen ions. It's the pH changing just a smidge. Like I'm talking it's barely measurable because it's very controlled. Um, and so the other aspect is, you know, yes, it's a signaling molecule. If you put it on muscle cells, it'll make them grow. But realistically, it clears very quickly. Like with probably in 30 seconds at the end of you finish a set, your lactate is like gone and you're back to baseline. So I feel out of, hey, I want to feel the burn. That's great. That kind of that metabolic stimulation that people like to talk about with hypertrophy, which is important. How important is debatable. Um, but then you also hear people say, I need to go on a run to get the lactate out of my system. And it's like, well, it actually cleared in like 30 seconds. So it's not there anymore. You could still do that. I tell people that's fine. Maybe it makes you feel better, increases blood flow, warms you up a little bit. But um, yeah, I would say with lactate specifically, avoid any type of training that's like specifically we're going to do lactate to grow a muscle because you can't really control it, and it's not that beneficial. It's just a way for your body to fuel itself.
Yeah. No, it's great. It's just, I love hitting these topics that it's one thing to discuss muscle biology and take a deep dive. And obviously we talked about that. That's what we did in the beginning. And then get to kind of your popular questions, that people have for resistance training or things they just kind of throw around but don't really know that much. Like another next one. I'm trying to go with the greatest hits here, Brandon. It's like the discussions related to muscle memory. Okay, with
Yeah,
this. This is another great topic that I think it just the lay population throws around quite a bit, and professionals too. Oh, if it's had this maybe detraining effect, I come back and I have muscle memory. So let's discuss that. The realities of this, myths, factual things, all that involved.
yeah, yeah. So that's a great topic. And actually, so the way people use it is like sort of kind of ish correct. Um, but from a muscle biology perspective, this is something that realistically we're on it's on the cutting edge. One of the few papers that came out on the topic was like within the past 5 years. So showing that, hey, if you exercise and then you like break your arm, right? And then you exercise again, you gain muscle back, right? And you gain it back quicker than you normally would. And so what we're looking at, and it's true that people have muscle memory in terms of even, if you stop working out for, I'd say, 6 to 8 months, it's a good way to come back. And it's something in the nucleus. So it's some kind of signaling thing where we have transcription and translation, right? So DNA, RNA, and then we have epigenetics. So the way things are manipulated in the DNA inside the nucleus. There's something going on there that allows your body to reactivate those systems better if you've
Yeah.
been training and then come back to training. So it's true that yes, if you train and stop and train again, you will have muscle memory. It will eventually turn to normal. But it's a super like interesting and kind of hot topic in muscle.
It actually just kinda like the way you're describing it makes me think about first and second line defense and immunity. In second line defense, essentially an inventory system that remembers past pathogens and goes, I remember this. So we're going to account for this and we're going to mitigate basically the exposure of the pathogens. And this, it feels kind of similar. It's like, well, I remember I've done this inventory here. So I'm going to help you get better quicker here. It just reminds me of that a little bit more, you know?
Yeah, yeah. And I would say that is a great example of the body is going to be as efficient as it can, right? It always wants to use the least amount of energy, the least amount of effort. So if there's a mechanism to allow you to train and adapt easier, it's probably going to use it within reason. So I think, yeah, great, interesting topic. There's not been a lot of formal studies. So let's say like you were an athlete and then you stopped being an athlete after college or high school.
Yeah.
And 20 years later, so you can go back in the gym and you're like, muscle memory. You're like, well, we don't know if that length of time is reasonable. I would say that, yeah, there's probably something there. But, you know, in weeks or months, they always worry about taking a week or two off training or a month or two off
Yeah.
training. And I have to tell them, like, you're not going to lose anything. You'll be totally fine. You'll take some like subjective adaptation when you get back in the gym. Things are going to feel heavier. But realistically, if you did a 1RM, if you took a whole month off, it probably wouldn't change very much. If you looked at your muscle size after a whole month of just not exercising, if you've been exercising for a long time, probably wouldn't change that much. When you look at some of the endurance aspects, though, those do change very quickly.
Yeah. That's right.
So, like, if you stop running for 2 weeks, like, you lose 20, 30% of your capacity to, like, tap out, which, is unfortunate because I don't mind running, but, and it doesn't mean that you have to kind of do cardio pretty regularly, whereas resistance training, you can take time off and it won't unadapt or detrain. You won't detrain
Yeah.
as fast.
I always tell clients this. I'm like, and the same thing, but I'm like, in terms of cardiorespiratory endurance, the body is brutal to you with this. I mean, you could work a really long time building up significant cardiorespiratory endurance, and your body's like, "Oh, you're not doing this anymore? Nope, we're gonna explode you way down."
Yeah,
It's actually demoralizing, and
it
it's
is.
it's like the volume of it is staying consistent with cardiorespiratory endurance is so important because the amount of the detraining effect is so severe versus I've
Yeah,
seen tons of studies with resistance training over many, many weeks of trained exercisers that essentially are pretty much the same without
yeah,
working out. And it's encouraging. It's hard with cardiorespiratory endurance. Yeah. It's
yeah.
desperate.
We did a study in my postdoc where we had people, basically, they would train regularly, like your standard 3 times a week, ACSM guideline type thing. And then we took them from 3 sets per exercise down to 1 set per exercise for 3 months, and some of them still improved. Like, that's how little they did a third of their total training, and they were still, like, slowly improving and not losing anything. And the people who stopped training lost like, a little bit, but I was just like, saw that we finished that study and I was like, this is ridiculous.
The dosage can be very
Yeah.
low to get
Yeah.
the effect, which I think sometimes is I think another thing, and people who listen to this are spending a lot of time in the gym, resistance training, hours, and not necessarily understanding that that dosage effect can be pretty minimal to actually make gains, if you will, you know?
Yeah, yeah. I tell people they're like, all right, what do I need to do to maximize hypertrophy? That's a very common question, especially from like college age people who want to get
Yeah.
big as fast as possible.
Yep.
And I too ask that question, right? And so current like practice and evidence suggest if you hit muscle groups at least 2 times a week, three is probably better, but we don't have a lot of evidence to say how much better. And aim for 10 to 20 sets over those 3 days, 2 or 3 days per muscle group. So like think quads. So that means that realistically, you do 3 sets of quads 3 times a week, you're almost there. Right, you're at 9
And
sets. And most people will train more than that, but
yeah.
that's kind of the current optimization of hypertrophy. It's how, and I even tell people, how little can you do to grow? Because you're gonna need that capacity later, so you're not in the gym for 2 hours.
Yeah.
Because, like, I'm sitting at, like, 15 sets per muscle group, I'm very happy with that because it's not 20, and that takes more
Yeah.
time.
That's exactly right. While we're getting towards the end here, I wanted to kind of go into the future at this
Mhm.
point. What excites you about muscle biology, or what breakthroughs do you think would change or reshape how we train?
Yeah, so we've been, looking for a drug for decades on how we can kind of have exercise in the pill, and we're not even close. Um, some of the newer drugs are interesting because like not everyone can exercise, right? Like
That's
a
right.
fact. People with this like abilities and diseases. So I'm really excited about some of the new myostatin inhibitors coming out. There's potential there to like prevent muscle loss. Um, there's training wise, I don't see anything that's gonna blow our socks off. Like maybe some of the retraining aspects, we're optimizing that a little bit better. Um, we've kind of like, and it's part of the reason I started to move a little bit away from exercise research as much is because like we kind of figured most things out and fine tuning it. Do I need 11 cents or 12 cents? It's like, well, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
It's so close. So I would say the drug world is really interesting because we can help a lot of people. Like you said earlier, people exercising, lifelong exercisers, that's a whole new population now because there are like 3 or 4 studies on those. But you take someone who's been exercising for 60 or 70 years and you like and just compare them to someone who hasn't, like that's gonna be insane. Um, and then all of these new like sports and ways to exercise too is kind of interesting. So I don't do like high rocks or I didn't do
Right.
CrossFit, for example, but they're good examples of like, hey, they're doing something, right?
Yeah. It's interesting. Lifelong exerciser studies, I would be so fascinated by that. I mean, I'd be one of those people. I mean, I started exercising when I was like 13,
Yeah.
and I think I've not exercised maybe a week in that time, some version of it. I don't know what my life is like without exercise. Like, it's just always been there, either as an athlete, moving beyond being an athlete, just a recreational exerciser, and it's literally like my arm. It's just part of me. And so I'm always curious about actually myself and what will I be like? Like I've never not had a life like this, and that we haven't studied this as much. I think we're going to be able to study it more because we're going to see a lot more lifelong exercisers, which I think is exciting.
Yeah, yeah, and that's where the science gets fun because you can say like, okay, what are the differences on, mechanisms and molecular biology that we've never even thought about because we don't have these to compare, right?
Yeah,
You get to some of those structural proteins, the nuclei, you've got all kinds of new discoveries waiting to happen. Just because people have more time and energy to exercise or just know that it's healthier now, right?
yeah.
Like it's I'm super excited about that aspect too.
This is awesome. This was just as good as I thought it would be. It's just seriously, I have so much gratitude for you giving me some of your time. Like everyone, we're all busy, but we could sit down together and just have these discussions. Dr. Roberts, I'm so grateful for that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Darren. I really appreciate it. And if any of your listeners have any questions, they can find me on LinkedIn or whatever. I'm happy to answer questions, or you can probably handle most of them. But I'm here if you need me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate you.